In the world of Ark raiders, beneath the ruins of what was once Italy, lies Speranza, a community that survived the Ark invasion by going underground while the rest of humanity fell to machines that literally dropped from the sky and reshaped everything we knew about survival. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now here's the thing about Speranza that most players don't realise when they first encounter this settlement in the lore. This isn't just some random bunker where people hid from the Ark machines. This is the culmination of years of preparation, desperation, and choices that would make you question what you'd do if mechanical death reigned from the heavens. The story of Speranza begins before the first Ark machine ever touched Earth's surface. We're talking about a time when governments across the world detected anomalies in space, strange readings that didn't match any known celestial patterns. Italian scientists were among the first to predict that whatever was coming wasn't natural, wasn't friendly, and most importantly, wasn't going to give humanity time to prepare a proper defense. These scientists, working in facilities scattered across Italy, started making contingency plans that their own government thought were paranoid delusions. They were mapping out underground networks, old mining tunnels, abandoned subway systems, anything that could provide shelter from an aerial threat. When the Ark machines finally arrived and started their systematic destruction of surface infrastructure, these scientists, and the people who believed them, had maybe a week's head start on everyone else. That week made all the difference between extinction and survival. The initial descent into what would become Speranza was chaos incarnate. Families were separated in the panic. People were making split-second decisions about what to bring into the tunnels, and the sounds of Ark machines tearing through cities above echoed down into the depths, like thunder that never stopped. The Italian government, what was left of it anyway, tried to maintain order, but when you're facing extinction, bureaucracy becomes meaningless pretty fast. The early days in the tunnels were defined by darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The power grid on the surface was one of the first things the Ark machines targeted, which meant the refugees huddled underground were relying on battery-powered lights, generators with limited fuel, and the terrifying knowledge that once those ran out, they'd be in complete darkness with no way to see what might be sharing the tunnels with them. But here's where the story of Speranza gets interesting, because unlike other survivor groups that dissolved into chaos or got picked off by Ark machines, the people in these Italian tunnels had something special. They had engineers who understood the old mining equipment still left in some of these tunnels. They had historians who knew about ancient Roman aqueducts that could provide water. They had farmers who immediately started thinking about hydroponics and how to grow food without sunlight. Speranza wasn't built in a day, it was built in the grinding, exhausting, never-ending work of people who refused to let the Ark machines win. The name Speranza itself, which means hope in Italian, wasn't chosen lightly. There was a vote, believe it or not. In those early weeks when they were still figuring out if they'd survive the month, some people wanted to name it after the old city above, to remember what was lost. Others wanted something completely new, to represent a fresh start, but the majority voted for Speranza because hope was the only resource they had in abundance, the only thing the Ark machines couldn't take away. Now let's talk about the layout of Speranza, because understanding the geography helps explain why the Ark machines aren't there. The settlement is built across multiple levels, following the natural and artificial cave systems that honeycomb the rock beneath central Italy. The uppermost levels are closest to the surface, maybe 50 to 70 meters down, and these became the industrial zones where the loudest, dirtiest work happens. This is where they repair equipment, where the smiths work, where anything that might create noise or vibration that could potentially be detected from above gets done. Go deeper and you hit the residential zones, carved out of old mining chambers and expanded through careful, quiet excavation. These are cramped spaces by surface standards, but the people of Speranza learn to live vertically, stacking sleeping quarters, using every cubic meter of space efficiently. The deepest levels are where they keep the most vital resources: the water treatment facilities tapping into underground aquifers, the seed banks, the medical supplies, the archives of human knowledge that survivors managed to bring down before the surface became a death trap. The reason the Ark machines aren't in Speranza comes down to a combination of factors that the settlers figured out through trial, error, and painful losses. First, the Ark machines' primary detection methods rely on electromagnetic signatures, heat signatures, and movement patterns on or near the surface. Speranza's depth provides natural shielding from most of these detection methods. The rock itself, rich in certain minerals, seems to interfere with whatever scanning technology the Ark machines use. Second, and this took a while to figure out, the Ark machines are primarily interested in structures, technology, and resources on the surface. They're not mining operations, they're more like a cleanup crew removing human civilization from the planet's face. Going underground, burrowing into the earth, that's not how the Ark machines operate, at least not in any patterns that Speranza's scouts have observed. Third, and this is the part that required the most discipline from Speranza's residents, is the strict protocols about surface activity. In the early days, some groups of survivors tried to maintain surface outposts, to salvage resources, to keep watch. Every single one of these attempts ended in detection and annihilation. The Ark machines are patient, they can wait, they can watch, and they will hunt down any sign of human activity they detect. Speranza survived by learning to be a ghost, by accepting that the surface world was lost, by committing completely to an underground existence. The settlement established a rule early on: no surface expeditions without unanimous council approval, no exceptions, and the council almost never approves. There was one expedition about 2 years after the settlement was established, a mission to retrieve medical supplies from a hospital that had been partially collapsed, but might still have intact storage areas. They sent 6 people, all volunteers, all understanding the risks. Only 2 came back, and the stories they told about the Ark machines hunting them through the rubble convinced the council to make the surface ban even stricter. But living underground comes with its own set of nightmares that have nothing to do with the Ark machines. The psychological impact of never seeing the sky, never feeling natural sunlight, never experiencing weather, it breaks people in ways that are hard to predict. Speranza has what they call the deep sickness, a condition where residents become convinced the walls are closing in, where they start experiencing claustrophobic panic attacks, where they lose the ability to sleep because their brain can't reconcile living in eternal artificial light with any natural circadian rhythm. The settlement's medical staff tried different approaches to treating deep sickness. They set up therapy groups, they created artificial day-night cycles with the lighting, they even designated certain chambers as parks where they tried to maintain the illusion of open space with painted murals and careful lighting design. Some people respond to treatment, they adapt, they find ways to make peace with the underground life. Others don't, and that's when things get dark because Speranza can't afford to lose people, but they also can't force someone to live in mental anguish. The food situation in Speranza is another constant challenge that shapes daily life in ways surface dwellers never had to consider. The hydroponic farms produce enough to prevent starvation, but they're operating on razor-thin margins with no room for crop failures. The diet is monotonous, lots of root vegetables, lots of mushrooms cultivated in the darkest chambers, protein from insects they farm specifically for that purpose. There's no meat unless someone manages to trap rats in the tunnels, and even then, it's a delicacy reserved for the sick or pregnant. The settlement's leadership, which evolved from the initial group of scientists and engineers into something more like a council of elders, faces impossible decisions on a regular basis. How do you allocate resources when there's never enough? How do you handle disputes when there's nowhere for people to go to cool off? How do you plan for a future when you're not even sure if humanity has one. One of the most controversial aspects of life in Speranza is the population control measures. This isn't something the leadership wanted to implement, but the math is unavoidable. The settlement can support a certain number of people based on food production, water availability, and living space. Exceeding that number means everyone suffers, means the margins get even thinner, means the risk of complete collapse increases. So there are rules about reproduction, about who can have children and when, enforced through a combination of social pressure and limited access to medical resources. These policies create resentment, create factions within the community, create the kind of tensions that, in the old world, might have led to civil war, but in Speranza just simmers beneath the surface, because everyone knows that internal conflict could destroy them faster than any arc machine. The children born in Speranza represent both the settlement's hope and its greatest tragedy. These kids have never seen the sky, never felt rain, never experienced any of the things that defined human existence for millennia. The older generation tries to teach them about the world that was, showing them pictures on old tablets powered by carefully rationed electricity, telling them stories about beaches and mountains and forests. But there's a growing disconnect, a generation gap that's more like a chasm, because how do you explain colour to someone who's only ever seen it on a screen? How do you make them understand what they've lost when they never had it to begin with? Some of the younger generation resent the older survivors for the world they lost, blame them for not fighting harder against the arc machines, question why they had to be born into this underground prison. Others become fascinated with the surface, obsessed with it, developing a dangerous romanticism about the world above that ignores the very real threat of the arc machines. This has led to several tragic incidents where young people attempted unauthorized surface expeditions, convinced they could succeed where others failed, convinced the adults were just being overcautious. None of these unauthorized expeditions ever returned, and each loss ripples through the small community like a stone thrown in a pond, creating waves of grief and anger and fear. The technology situation in Speranza is a constant race against entropy. Everything they have is scavenged, repurposed, or carefully maintained from before the Ark invasion. There are no factories producing new electronics, no supply chains delivering replacement parts. When something breaks, they have to fix it with whatever materials are available, and the engineers performing these repairs are working with a knowledge base that gets more fragmented with each passing year. There are systems in Speranza that only one or two people understand how to maintain, and if those people die before passing on their knowledge, that system might become irreparable. This has led to an almost religious reverence for documentation, for teaching, for making sure that practical knowledge gets distributed as widely as possible. But even with these efforts, they're slowly losing technological capability, slowly regressing towards simpler tools and methods, because complexity requires resources they simply don't have. The water supply drawn from deep aquifers is maybe the most critical resource in Speranza, even more than food. The settlement sits above ancient water sources that have been isolated from surface contamination for thousands of years, which means they're still pure, still drinkable. But the equipment needed to pump this water, to purify it, to distribute it throughout the settlement, that equipment is aging, breaking down, becoming harder to maintain. There are backup systems, of course, manual pumps that can be operated if the electric pumps fail, but manual pumping would require a significant portion of the settlement's population working in shifts, drastically reducing the labour available for other essential tasks. This vulnerability, this single point of failure, keeps the settlement's leaders awake at night, because they know that if the water systems catastrophically fail, Speranza dies in days, not weeks. The question of why the arc machines aren't in Speranza ultimately comes down to them not knowing Speranza exists, or at least not caring enough about it to make the effort to dig them out. The arc machines operate on a logic that humans still don't fully understand, a set of priorities and objectives that seem focused on eliminating surface civilization and human technological infrastructure. Underground settlements like Speranza fall outside this operational envelope, existing in a blind spot that's partly geographic, partly technological, and partly just a matter of the Ark machine's programming or decision-making process, not accounting for humans going deep enough underground. But this doesn't mean Speranza is safe, just safer than the alternative. The settlers live with the constant knowledge that this could change, that the Ark machines could evolve, could expand their operational parameters, could decide one day that eliminating underground holdouts is worth the effort. There are contingency plans for if the Ark machines ever breach Speranza, deeper tunnels that have been scouted, emergency supplies cached in hidden locations, a whole network of fallback positions that hopefully would give people a chance to escape if the worst happened. But everyone knows these plans are mostly psychological comfort, because if the Ark machines find Speranza and decide to destroy it, there probably won't be any escape. The isolation of Speranza is both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The lack of contact with other survivor groups means they don't have to share resources, don't have to negotiate or compete, don't have to worry about being betrayed or invaded by other desperate humans. But it also means they have no idea if they're the last humans alive, no way to share knowledge or technology, no possibility of mutual aid if disaster strikes. There have been debates about trying to establish long-range communication with other potential survivor groups, maybe using old radio equipment, maybe trying to set up some kind of coded message system. But every simulation, every analysis, every risk assessment comes to the same conclusion. Any signal strong enough to reach potential allies would also be strong enough for the Ark machines to detect, and the risk of drawing Ark attention to Speranza far outweighs any potential benefit from contacting other survivors. So Speranza remains silent, a pocket of humanity that for all intents and purposes might as well be on another planet, isolated by choice and by necessity. The cultural evolution happening in Speranza is fascinating in a tragic sort of way. Cut off from the broader world, living in such constrained circumstances, the settlement is developing its own distinct identity, its own customs and traditions that diverge from the surface world they came from. There are new holidays built around the settlement's founding, around successful harvests from the hydroponic farms, around the birthdays of children who represent hope for the future. There's a developing oral tradition, stories and songs that help preserve history, but also shape it, emphasizing the values that help the community survive, like cooperation, sacrifice, and resilience. Language is starting to shift too, with new words emerging for concepts specific to underground life, old words taking on new meanings or falling out of use because they refer to things that no longer exist in their world. In another few generations, if Speranza survives that long, the people living there might speak a dialect of Italian that would be barely recognizable to a speaker from before the Ark invasion. Religion and spirituality in Speranza have taken interesting turns. Some residents cling to traditional faiths, finding comfort in the familiar rituals and beliefs, interpreting the Ark invasion through theological frameworks as a test or a punishment or a trial that humanity must endure. Others have rejected religion entirely, seeing the Ark machines as proof that there's no benevolent deity watching over humanity, that the universe is indifferent to human suffering. And then there's a growing group, especially among the younger generation, that has developed what might be called a new faith, a belief system that treats the earth itself as a conscious entity that sent the Ark machines to cleanse the surface of human infection, and that the only path to redemption is to live in harmony with the planet by staying underground, by minimizing their impact, by essentially accepting permanent exile from the surface as humanity's penance. This belief system is controversial, to put it mildly, because it implies that the suffering of Speranza's residents is justified, that they deserve their underground prison and that any attempt to reclaim the surface would be not just dangerous, but morally wrong. The leadership of Speranza has to constantly balance competing interests and factions, managing tensions that, in the confined space of the settlement, could explode into violence that would be catastrophic for everyone. There are the pragmatists who just want to focus on survival day to day, not worrying about the future beyond the next harvest. There are the optimists who believe that someday, somehow, the Ark machines will leave, or be defeated, and humanity can reclaim the surface. There are the pessimists who think Speranza is just delaying the inevitable extinction of the human race. And there are the radicals who want to take action, who want to fight back against the Ark machines somehow, even though everyone knows any direct confrontation would be suicide. These radicals are usually young, usually people who've never seen the Ark machines in action, who've only heard stories and look at the old weapons cached in Speranza's armoury and think maybe, just maybe, there's a chance. The council has to carefully manage these impulses, has to channel that energy into productive activities, because they can't afford internal strife, but they also can't completely crush the human spirit's tendency toward hope and resistance. The archives in Speranza represent humanity's attempt to preserve itself beyond just physical survival. These are temperature-controlled chambers in the deep levels where they store hard drives, books, artifacts, anything that represents human culture and knowledge from before the Ark invasion. There are volunteers who dedicate their lives to cataloguing, preserving, and teaching from these archives, making sure that if humanity does have a future, it won't have to start from scratch. There are terabytes of data covering everything from scientific research to movies to music to literature. A digital library of Alexandria that could rebuild civilization if given the chance. But maintaining these archives is increasingly difficult as power becomes scarcer, as storage media degrades, as the people who understand the old file formats and systems die off. There's a constant triage happening, deciding what knowledge is essential enough to expend resources preserving, what can be allowed to fade away, and with each hard decision, to let some piece of human culture deteriorate because they can't afford to maintain it. A little bit more of the old world dies. The question that haunts every resident of Speranza, whether they admit it or not, is what's the end game here? Are they just surviving for the sake of surviving, postponing the inevitable until resources run out or systems fail or the deep sickness claims too many people? Is there any realistic scenario where humanity emerges from underground and reclaims the planet? Or is Speranza just a tomb that happens to still have living people in it, a place where the human species goes to die slowly instead of quickly? Some people find meaning in the survival itself, in preserving human life for even one more day, one more generation, believing that as long as someone is alive, there's hope. Others struggle with the seeming futility of it all, wondering if it wouldn't have been more merciful to die quickly on the surface rather than eke out this twilight existence underground. The truth is, nobody knows what the future holds for Speranza, and that uncertainty is perhaps the hardest thing to live with. The settlement scouts, the few brave or crazy enough to venture near the upper levels, and occasionally peek at the surface through carefully concealed observation points, report that the Ark machines are still there, still active, still patrolling the ruins of human civilization, like guards making sure nothing comes back. There's been no sign of the Ark machines leaving, no indication that their mission, whatever it is, has been completed. If anything, the scouts report that the Ark machines seem to be building something, transforming the surface into structures and installations whose purposes are incomprehensible to human observers. This has led to speculation that the Ark invasion wasn't just about destroying humanity, but about reshaping Earth for some other purpose, making it suitable for something else, something that hasn't arrived yet. If that's true, then Speranza's hope of eventually reclaiming the surface might be even more futile than anyone imagined, because they might not just be fighting against machines, but against a fundamental transformation of the planet itself. The mental health crisis in Speranza is something the settlement struggles to address with limited resources. There are maybe 3 trained therapists among the survivors, trying to support a population of several hundred people, all dealing with trauma, grief, claustrophobia, and existential dread. Suicide is more common than anyone wants to admit. People who just can't take another day of underground existence, who choose to end it rather than continue suffering. The settlement has had to establish protocols for dealing with these deaths, rituals that honour the deceased, while also serving as pressure release valves for the community's collective grief. There are memorial walls where names are carved, remembering not just those who died but how they lived, what they contributed to Speranza's survival. And there's an unspoken understanding that while suicide is tragic, it's also sometimes understandable, that judging people for reaching their breaking point would be cruel when everyone is dancing so close to that edge themselves. The children's education in Speranza focuses heavily on practical skills, the kind of knowledge that keeps the settlement running. Kids learn engineering, hydroponics, water purification, medical care, all the essential functions that need to be passed down to the next generation. But there's also an effort to teach history, to make sure they know where humanity came from, what was lost, what's worth preserving. This creates a weird dichotomy where a 10-year-old might be able to repair a water pump, but also know about the Renaissance, might never have seen a tree but can identify different species from pictures and understand their ecological roles. The education system in Speranza is simultaneously more advanced and more limited than anything that existed before the Ark invasion, producing children who are incredibly capable in some areas and completely ignorant in others. One of the most closely guarded secrets in Speranza is how close they've come to total collapse on multiple occasions, crises that were averted through luck, ingenuity, or desperate measures that the council doesn't want the general population knowing about. There was the fungal outbreak in the hydroponic bays that nearly destroyed 3 months of crops before they figured out how to contain it. There was the structural failure in one of the residential levels that killed 8 people and could have collapsed the entire section if the engineers hadn't worked around the clock to stabilise it. There was the attempted coup by a faction that wanted to take control of the council, convinced they could manage resources better, a situation that was resolved through negotiation but came terrifyingly close to armed conflict. The council keeps these near misses quiet because they believe the population needs to have confidence in the settlement's stability, needs to believe that Speranza is secure, because without that belief, panic could set in, and panic in such a confined space, with such limited resources, could be more destructive than any external threat. The relationship between Speranza and the surface is complex, filled with longing and fear in equal measure. There are viewing chambers, heavily shielded observation posts in the upper levels, where people can, very occasionally, look at the surface through periscopes and cameras, seeing the ruins of the world they lost. These viewings are rationed, controlled, because they're psychologically difficult, triggering grief and rage and despair in many who participate. But they're also necessary, reminders of why the settlement exists, why the sacrifices matter, why they can't give up. The images from the surface show a world that's alien now, cities overgrown with vegetation that's somehow different, changed, possibly by Ark technology, or possibly just by the absence of human management. The Ark machines themselves appear in these observations, moving with purpose through the ruins, constructing things, dismantling things, following patterns that human observers can't quite decipher. Watching them is like watching insects going about their business, completely indifferent to the humans observing them, operating on a scale and timeline that makes human concerns irrelevant. The technology of the Ark machines, from what little can be observed, seems to violate several fundamental principles of physics as humans understood them, suggesting either that our understanding was incomplete, or that the Ark machines come from somewhere with different physical laws. They move in ways that shouldn't be possible, generate power from sources that aren't apparent, communicate through methods that don't register on any human instruments. This technological gap is so vast that even talking about fighting back seems absurd, like Stone Age humans planning to wage war against a modern military. The few weapons Speranza has, mostly small arms that survivors brought with them, would be about as effective against arc machines as throwing rocks. But they keep them anyway, oiled and maintained, partly for dealing with potential human threats in the tunnels, partly for the psychological comfort of having some means of defense, however inadequate. The social structure of Speranza has evolved into something that doesn't quite fit any political system from before the Ark invasion. The council makes major decisions, but most of daily life is governed by informal networks of mutual obligation and reciprocity. People trade favors, share resources, help each other, not because of laws or enforcement, but because everyone understands that cooperation is survival. There's very little crime in the traditional sense, partly because there's nowhere to hide in such a small community, partly because the social pressure is immense, partly because the consequences of antisocial behaviour could include exile from the settlement, which is effectively a death sentence. This creates a society that's simultaneously more harmonious and more oppressive than what's existed before, where people mostly get along, but also where individual freedom is severely constrained by the needs of the collective. The question of genetic diversity is starting to concern the settlement's medical staff, who understand that a population of a few hundred people doesn't have enough genetic variability to sustain a healthy breeding population long term. Inbreeding depression will become a serious problem in a few more generations, leading to increased genetic disorders, reduced fertility, weakened immune systems. The settlement has a genetic registry, tracking family lines, trying to arrange pairings that maximize diversity, but the math is unavoidable. Without contact with other survivor groups, without new genetic material being introduced, Speranza is facing a slow genetic collapse that no amount of careful planning can prevent. This is one of those problems that the leadership knows about but can't solve, can't even really address publicly without causing despair, so it sits like a ticking time bomb in the background of all their planning. The relationship between individual liberty and collective survival is a constant tension in Speranza. How much freedom can people have when the group's survival depends on everyone following strict rules and protocols? How much choice should individuals get when their choices could endanger everyone else? These aren't abstract philosophical questions, but daily realities that shape everything from reproductive rights to food distribution to living space allocation. The settlement has tried to maintain some semblance of democratic processes, with the council being elected and major decisions being put to community votes, but there's an understanding that democracy has limits when you're living on the knife's edge of survival, that sometimes decisions need to be made quickly by people with expertise. That majority rule can't be allowed to override basic survival requirements. This creates a system that's democratic in form, but often authoritarian in function, and the contradiction bothers people, but not enough to change it because everyone knows the alternative could be chaos. The mythology growing up around the Ark invasion in Speranza is interesting because it's happening in real time, with people who lived through the events still alive, to correct or confirm the stories. But already there's embellishment, details being added or changed to make the narratives more dramatic or meaningful, heroes being created, villains being identified, patterns being imposed on what was mostly chaos and terror. In another generation or two, the true history of the invasion and Speranza's founding will probably be impossible to separate from the legends, which is how oral history works, how all history works really, but it's strange to watch it happen when you know the messy, unheroic reality underneath. The physical health of Speranza's residents is another area of concern that the medical staff tries to manage with inadequate resources. The lack of sunlight means vitamin D deficiencies are universal, addressed through supplements salvaged from the surface and rationed carefully. The diet, while sufficient in calories, is nutritionally incomplete in various ways, leading to health problems that would have been easily preventable in the old world. The air quality in the tunnels, despite filtration systems, isn't ideal, leading to respiratory issues in many long-term residents. Exercise space is limited, leading to problems associated with sedentary lifestyles. And the medical supplies, the antibiotics, the painkillers, the equipment, all of it is finite, being used up with no way to replace it. The doctors in Speranza are increasingly relying on medieval medical techniques, herbs and compresses, and surgery without anesthesia when the drugs run out, watching people die from conditions that would have been trivial to treat before the Ark invasion. The concept of privacy in Speranza is almost non-existent, which creates its own set of psychological stresses. The living quarters are cramped, walls are thin, everyone knows everyone else's business, secrets are almost impossible to keep, relationships are public knowledge, conflicts become community affairs. This lack of privacy is both oppressive and oddly comforting. Oppressive because humans need some space that's just theirs, but comforting because it means no one is truly alone, truly isolated. The settlement has tried to create some private spaces, meditation chambers, reading nooks, places where people can be alone with their thoughts for a while, but demand far exceeds supply, and time in these spaces has to be rationed, like everything else. The work culture in Speranza is intense, with almost everyone working most of their waking hours just to keep the settlement functioning. There's no real concept of leisure time, no entertainment industry, no hobbies that don't serve some practical purpose. People are expected to contribute according to their abilities, and those who can't or won't work are a source of resentment and tension. The elderly and disabled are cared for, but there's an undercurrent of calculation, a question of whether the resources they consume are justified by their existence. A utilitarian calculus that would have been horrifying in the old world, but seems pragmatic when you're counting calories and square meters of living space. This creates guilt and anxiety among those who feel like they're not pulling their weight, and sometimes that anxiety manifests in tragic ways. The question of whether Speranza should try to make contact with the surface, try to scavenge more resources, try to fight back against the Ark machines, comes up periodically and always creates heated debates. The risk-averse faction points out that every surface expedition has ended badly, that the settlement has survived precisely because it stayed hidden, that changing strategy now could bring destruction on everyone. The risk-tolerant faction argues that they're slowly dying anyway, that resources are running out, that they'll eventually have to engage with the surface whether they want to or not, that waiting just means getting weaker. The council usually sides with caution, but the pressure to do something, anything, rather than just waiting for the end, is growing, especially among younger residents who feel like they've been condemned to slow death without being given a chance to fight. The infrastructure of Speranza is a patchwork of repurposed equipment, salvaged materials, and increasingly desperate improvisation. The electrical system runs on a combination of generators burning carefully rationed biofuel, batteries that are recharged when the generators run, and human-powered systems for critical backups. The ventilation system pushes air through kilometers of ducting, pulling fresh air from carefully hidden surface intakes and expelling stale air through locations chosen to minimize detection risk. The water system is a mix of electric pumps, manual backups, and gravity-fed distribution for the lowest levels. All of these systems are fragile, interdependent, and aging, maintained by engineers who are making miracles happen with inadequate tools and parts. Every day the systems keep running as a small victory, and everyone knows that when they finally fail, catastrophically, there probably won't be a way to fix them. The cultural life of Speranza, what little exists, centres around communal gatherings where people share stories, music, and whatever passes for entertainment in the underground. There are musicians who've maintained instruments from the surface, playing songs that carry memory and meaning from the lost world. There are storytellers who've taken on the role of preserving history and mythology, keeping the oral traditions alive. There are artists who work with whatever materials are available, creating beauty in a place designed purely for function and survival. These cultural activities are considered essential by many residents, not luxuries, but necessities for maintaining humanity and hope. Yet they're also viewed suspiciously by the pragmatists, who see them as resource drains, as time and energy that could be spent on survival tasks. This tension between practical survival and what makes life worth living is never fully resolved, just endlessly negotiated and renegotiated as circumstances change. The dreams of Speranza's residents provide a window into their psychological state that the settlement's few therapists find both revealing and heartbreaking. Almost everyone reports dreams about the surface, but these dreams vary wildly in character. The older residents, those who remember the world before, dream about specific places, their old homes, favourite restaurants, parks where they used to walk, beaches they visited, and they wake up with tears on their faces, mourning losses that feel fresh every single morning. The younger generation dreams about the surface too, but their dreams are constructed from photographs and stories, fantastical and often inaccurate, imagining forests that glow, oceans that sparkle with impossible colours, cities that defy physics. And then there are the nightmares, the dreams about arc machines breaking into Speranza, about being trapped in collapsing tunnels, about watching loved ones die, about suffocating in darkness. These nightmares are so common that the settlement has support groups specifically for dealing with them, people gathering to share their fears and hopefully diminish them through communal processing. The leadership succession in Speranza is a looming question that nobody wants to address directly, but everyone thinks about. The original council members, the scientists and engineers who led the initial descent and establishment of the settlement, are aging, and their knowledge and experience are irreplaceable. There are younger people being trained to take over, learning the systems, the history, the decision-making processes, but there's a fundamental gap between those who remember the world before and those who don't, a difference in perspective that creates misunderstandings and conflicts about priorities and values. The original leaders tend to be more cautious, more aware of what can go wrong because they've seen it happen, while the younger generation is more willing to take risks, more frustrated with the status quo, more eager to do something, even if that something is dangerous. This generational divide is going to come to a head eventually, and how that transition of power happens will determine a lot about Speranza's future, assuming it has one. The concept of money in Speranza has become mostly obsolete, replaced by a system of labour credits and direct barter that reflects the realities of their situation. You can't eat money, you can't breathe it, and in a closed system where everything is rationed anyway, currency doesn't serve much purpose. But this has created its own inequalities, with people who have valuable skills or control critical resources having more influence and better living conditions than those who do manual labour or who can't work. The settlement has tried to maintain some level of equality, ensuring everyone gets basic necessities regardless of their contribution. But human nature being what it is, hierarchies have formed, informal but very real. The engineers and doctors are at the top, their skills essential and rare. Below them are the farmers who manage food production, the technicians who maintain systems, the teachers who educate the next generation. At the bottom are the general labourers, the people doing the necessary but unskilled work, and those who can't work at all. This hierarchy isn't officially acknowledged, and the council works to minimise it, but everyone feels it. Everyone knows their place in the social order, and resentments simmer beneath the surface of community harmony. The archive workers in Speranza have a particularly strange job, spending their days cataloguing and preserving a world they'll never see, maintaining knowledge that may never be used. They watch old movies and write summaries, they read books and create indexes, they organise scientific papers and technical manuals, they preserve art and music, all on the assumption that someday, somehow, this information will be needed. But there's a growing question among them about the point of their work. If humanity is confined to Speranza forever, if they never reclaim the surface, if the settlement eventually fails, as all closed systems must, then what's the purpose of preserving Shakespeare and Einstein and Beethoven? Who are they preserving it for? The answer they've settled on is that the preservation itself is an act of defiance, a statement that human culture matters, that what we created and thought and felt has value independent of whether it has practical utility. The archives are a monument to human achievement, and maintaining them is an assertion that humanity deserves to be remembered, even if there's no one left to remember. The spiritual counselors in Speranza, representing various religious traditions, have developed an ecumenical approach to their work, recognizing that denominational differences matter a lot less when you're facing possible extinction. There are Catholic priests and Muslim imams and Jewish rabbis and Buddhist monks all working together, providing comfort and guidance to whoever needs it, regardless of their specific beliefs. They've created hybrid ceremonies that draw from multiple traditions, rituals that speak to the universal human need for meaning and connection, rather than enforcing particular doctrines. This has been surprisingly successful at providing spiritual support to the community, though it's also created a new form of faith that's distinctly Speranza's own. A survival religion that emphasizes endurance, community, sacrifice, and hope without getting too specific about theological details that might be divisive. The younger generation, growing up in this ecumenical environment, tends to have a more fluid, less dogmatic approach to spirituality than their parents, which is either a positive evolution or a tragic loss depending on who you ask. The question of what happens to bodies after death in Speranza is a practical and emotional challenge that the settlement has had to address. Burial in the traditional sense isn't really possible. They can't afford to dedicate space to cemeteries, and the rock is too hard to dig graves easily. Cremation would work, but requires fuel they can't spare. The solution they've arrived at is a form of composting, breaking down bodies to return nutrients to the hydroponic systems. A circular economy that makes practical sense but that many find disturbing or sacrilegious. The settlement has tried to make this process as dignified as possible, with ceremonies and rituals that honour the deceased before their physical remains are recycled. But there's no getting around the basic reality that in Speranza, death feeds life in very literal ways. This has created interesting theological discussions about the nature of the body and soul, about resurrection and what happens after death, discussions that often conclude with people deciding they're okay with their bodies feeding the community after they're gone, because at least it means they're still contributing, still part of Speranza even after death. The children's games in Speranza reflect their underground reality in ways that are sometimes charming and sometimes heartbreaking. They play hide and seek in the tunnels. They create imaginary scenarios involving arc machines and surface expeditions. They draw pictures of things they've never seen based on descriptions from adults. There's a game that's become popular among the younger kids where they pretend to be arc machines hunting human survivors, which disturbs some adults, but which child psychologists say is actually a healthy way of processing fear by transforming from victim to predator in play. There's another game where they imagine being able to fly, spreading their arms and running through the tunnels making whooshing sounds, which is poignant because the concept of an open sky is so abstract to them that flight is pure fantasy. The older kids tend toward more serious pursuits, learning trades, helping with settlement work, but they also gather in small groups to talk about the surface, to plan imaginary expeditions, to dream about lives they'll never have. The settlement's few luxuries, the things that aren't strictly necessary for survival, but that make life bearable, are fiercely protected and carefully rationed. There's a small supply of coffee that was brought down in the initial evacuation, doled out on special occasions in tiny amounts that are more symbolic than caffeinated. There's a cache of chocolate that's being saved for emergencies or celebrations. though what constitutes an emergency worthy of chocolate is subject to debate. There are a few bottles of alcohol, mostly wine, that are used for ceremonies and medical purposes. There are books, actual physical books, that are treated like treasures, passed around, read carefully to avoid damaging them, cherished for the escape they provide. There's a guitar, a violin, a flute, instruments that are played regularly to maintain them and to provide music for the community. These luxuries are distributed by the council based on need and merit, which creates its own politics and resentments, because deciding who deserves a cup of coffee or a chapter of a novel becomes a statement about whose well-being matters, whose morale is worth the expenditure of irreplaceable resources. The maintenance workers in Speranza have the most intimate relationship with the settlement's fragility, working daily with systems that are one failure away from catastrophe. They can hear in the sounds of the machines when something is starting to go wrong. They can feel in the vibrations when a bearing is wearing out. They can smell when electrical insulation is degrading. They live with the knowledge that they're performing triage on infrastructure that's slowly dying, patching and improvising and praying that nothing breaks beyond their ability to fix it. Some of them have anxiety that borders on paranoia, constantly checking systems, unable to sleep because they're worried something will fail in the night. Others have developed a fatalistic acceptance, figuring they'll deal with problems when they happen and worrying won't prevent anything. The council relies heavily on these workers, trusts their judgment about what needs attention, funnels resources toward maintenance because they understand that prevention is cheaper than catastrophe, but there's never enough resources to do everything that needs doing. So the maintenance workers are constantly making impossible choices about what to fix and what to let slide. The concept of privacy extends even to thoughts and feelings in Speranza, where people have learned to maintain internal spaces that are just theirs, secrets they keep not because they're shameful, but because everyone needs something that's not shared, not communal, not subject to group discussion. This internal privacy is the last refuge of individuality in a place where almost everything else is collective, and people guard it jealously, sometimes refusing to share their thoughts, even with close friends or family, because those thoughts are the only thing that's purely their own. The therapists in the settlement have noticed this tendency and generally support it, recognizing that some degree of internal privacy is psychologically necessary even when external privacy is impossible. But it also creates distances between people, walls that prevent full intimacy, relationships that are close but not completely open because everyone is holding something back. Maintaining a private self that can't be touched by the claustrophobic communal life. The education of children in Speranza includes a subject that didn't exist in the old world, what they call survival psychology, teaching kids from an early age how to manage fear, how to handle claustrophobia, how to find meaning in constrained circumstances, how to maintain hope without denying reality. This is considered as essential as reading or math, because a child who can't psychologically handle underground life is a child who will become an adult at risk of deep sickness or worse. The curriculum was developed by the settlement's therapists and teachers working together, drawing on psychology, philosophy, and practical experience to create something that would prepare children for the unique challenges of Speranza. It's been remarkably successful, with the generation born in the settlement showing lower rates of serious psychological problems than their parents, but it's also created kids who are in some ways emotionally harder, more stoic, less expressive than children used to be, adapted to an environment that requires constant emotional regulation. The question of whether this is good or bad, whether they're raising resilient survivors or emotionally stunted individuals, is hotly debated among the adults. The rumours and conspiracy theories that circulate in Speranza are a constant challenge for the leadership to manage. In a closed community where information is controlled and life is stressful, people naturally speculate and create narratives to explain what they don't understand. There are rumours that the council is hoarding food, that there are secret luxury areas hidden in the deep tunnels where the elite live, that the ARC machines are actually human technology gone wrong, that there are other survivor groups that Speranza is deliberately not contacting. Most of these rumours are false, born from anxiety and the human need to find patterns and assign blame, but some have kernels of truth, distorted through retelling until they're barely recognisable. The Council has tried different approaches to managing rumours, from ignoring them to directly addressing them to opening up more information to the community. But nothing really works because the root cause is the uncertainty and powerlessness that everyone feels. In some ways, the rumours serve a psychological function, giving people something to focus on besides the grinding reality of their situation, providing narratives of agency and control, even if those narratives are fictional. The anniversary of the ARC invasion is observed in Speranza with mixed emotions. A day of mourning for what was lost, but also a celebration of survival, of having made it another year against the odds. The ceremonies have evolved over the years into a ritual that combines grief and defiance, with people sharing memories of the world before, naming those who died, and reaffirming their commitment to survival and to each other. There's a tradition of lighting candles, one for each person lost, which in the early years meant hundreds of candles, but which now includes those who've died in Speranza as well. So the number grows every year. The settlement gathers in the largest chamber, and for a few hours, differences are set aside, factions are forgotten, and everyone is united in their shared history and shared fate. It's one of the few times when the community feels truly cohesive, when the social divisions and resentments fade into the background, when people remember that they're all in this together. And then the ceremony ends, the candles are extinguished to save wax, and everyone returns to their quarters and their routines and their private struggles, carrying the memory of unity until the next anniversary. The technological regression happening in Speranza is visible in small ways that accumulate over time. They're using more and more mechanical solutions instead of electronic ones because mechanics are easier to repair with limited resources. They're relying on human labour for tasks that used to be automated because the automation requires power and maintenance they can't afford. They're losing the ability to manufacture certain items, falling back on simpler designs that can be made with available tools and materials. The engineers watch this regression with frustration and sadness, knowing that each step backward is probably permanent, that knowledge is being lost, that the technological base is shrinking. They try to document everything, to preserve the knowledge even if they can't maintain the capability, but documentation only goes so far when you don't have the resources to implement what's documented. There's a recognition that Speranza is slowly sliding down the technology ladder, and that if this continues long enough, they'll end up at a pre-industrial level of technology, which would actually be more sustainable than what they have now, but which would represent a tremendous loss of human capability and knowledge. The social contracts in Speranza, the unwritten rules that govern behaviour and relationships, are stricter than anything that existed in the old world. There's an expectation of mutual support that goes beyond law into moral obligation, a sense that everyone is responsible for everyone else, because that's the only way the settlement survives. This creates a society that's more caring in some ways, where people genuinely look out for each other, where isolation and loneliness are less common because the community won't allow someone to completely withdraw. But it's also a society where deviance from norms is punished harshly, where being different or difficult can make you a pariah, where social pressure to conform is immense and constant. The balance between community support and community control is delicate, and different people experience it differently, depending on how well they fit the settlement's expectations. Those who naturally align with the community values find Speranza supportive and nurturing, while those who chafe against the restrictions find it suffocating and oppressive. And there's no real middle ground, no way to opt out of the social contract without opting out of the settlement itself. The long-term effects of living underground on human health are still being discovered, and none of them are positive. Beyond the obvious issues with vitamin deficiencies and lack of exercise, there are subtler problems emerging. The constant artificial light seems to be affecting circadian rhythms in ways that lead to sleep disorders and metabolic issues. The limited genetic diversity is starting to show up in increased rates of certain inherited conditions. The stress of confinement is manifesting in cardiovascular problems, immune system dysfunction, accelerated aging. The doctors in Speranza are essentially conducting an unintentional experiment on what happens to humans when they're removed from the environment they evolved for and confined in artificial conditions for extended periods. And the results suggest that humans really weren't designed for this kind of existence. But knowing that doesn't change anything, doesn't provide solutions, just adds another layer of despair to the already difficult reality. The younger generation has adapted better physiologically, their bodies developing in the underground environment, but even they show signs of problems, and nobody knows what the long-term implications will be for future generations if Speranza survives that long. The power dynamics in personal relationships within Speranza are complicated by the settlement circumstances. Domestic abuse happens, as it does in any community, but in Speranza there's nowhere for victims to go, no way to escape an abusive situation without leaving the settlement entirely. This has forced the community to develop interventions and consequences for abusers that try to protect victims, while also recognizing that they can't afford to exile people for anything short of the most extreme offences. Relationships are also complicated by the reproductive policies, with people's choice of partners being influenced by genetic considerations and population limits. There are couples who want children but aren't allowed because of genetic concerns or because the settlement is at capacity. There are people who are encouraged to partner with specific individuals to maximize genetic diversity, turning what should be personal romantic decisions into community planning exercises. This interference in intimate life is deeply resented by many, but the alternatives, allowing unrestricted reproduction or ignoring genetic factors, would lead to problems that could threaten the settlement's survival. So people mostly accept it, even as they hate it. The concept of the arc machines, as almost a force of nature rather than an enemy, has taken hold in Speranza's collective consciousness. They're not hated the way human enemies would be. They're feared and avoided like a natural disaster, like an earthquake or a plague. This psychological framing actually helps people cope, because you can't negotiate with a storm, you can't reason with a volcano, you just survive them if you can. Treating the arc machines as impersonal forces rather than malicious enemies removes the emotional weight of betrayal or injustice, makes the situation feel less like persecution and more like bad luck. It's not that anyone wanted to destroy humanity specifically, it's just that the arc machines had their own purposes and humanity was in the way, like how humans building a road don't hate the ant colony they destroy. They just needed to use that space. This depersonalization of the threat is both psychologically healthier and kind of horrifying, because it means accepting that human existence doesn't matter on the cosmic scale, that we can be wiped out as collateral damage without it meaning anything. The seasonal cycles that used to govern human life have no meaning in Speranza, where every day is essentially the same as every other day. The temperature controlled, the lighting artificial and constant. This timelessness is disorienting in ways that are hard to articulate, contributing to the psychological difficulties residents face. The settlement has tried to create artificial seasons, changing the lighting patterns, organising events around an arbitrary calendar, but it's not the same. It doesn't carry the weight of actual seasonal change. People lose track of time, can't remember if something happened months ago or years ago, feel like they're stuck in an eternal present without past or future. The archivists who maintain the calendar and mark the passage of time perform an essential psychological function, giving people anchor points, ways to measure their lives and mark progress, even when every day feels identical. Without these timekeepers, the residents would likely lose any sense of temporal continuity, which studies have shown can lead to serious psychological problems. The stories that parents tell children in Speranza about the Ark invasion have evolved into a form of cautionary folklore, where the machines are almost mythological in their portrayal, terrifying and incomprehensible forces that punish humans for their hubris or their wastefulness or whatever moral lesson the storyteller wants to impart. These stories serve multiple purposes, teaching children to respect the danger of the surface, reinforcing the values that keep the settlement functioning, providing explanations for why their lives are the way they are. But they're also creating a mythology that diverges from the actual historical record, and the archivists worry about what happens when the generation that remembers the truth is gone, and all that's left are these mythologized versions. There's a tension between preserving accurate history and allowing culture to evolve naturally, between truth and meaning, between what actually happened and what people need to believe happened. The council has debated whether to standardize the stories to create an official narrative, but they've decided against it so far, recognizing that trying to control culture usually backfires and that some degree of mythologization is probably inevitable and maybe even necessary. The repair workshops in Speranza are filled with cannibalized equipment, devices that have been taken apart to keep other devices running, a constant process of triage where less essential systems are sacrificed to maintain critical ones. The engineers running these workshops have encyclopedic knowledge of what parts exist, where, what can be repurposed for what purpose, which systems are redundant enough to strip for components. They perform daily miracles of improvisation, creating replacement parts from unlikely materials, jury-rigging solutions that shouldn't work but somehow do. But they're also fighting a losing battle against entropy, against the fundamental reality that in a closed system with no new inputs, everything eventually breaks down beyond repair. They've managed to extend the functional life of the settlement's equipment far beyond what anyone thought possible, but they know it can't last forever. They can feel the settlement's technological capability degrading year by year, and there's nothing they can do to stop it, only slow it down. The pride they take in their work is mixed with the grief of knowing that they're just delaying the inevitable. The meditation and quiet spaces in Speranza are some of the most valued real estate in the settlement. Small chambers or alcoves where people can be alone with their thoughts, where they can have silence and solitude for brief periods. Access to these spaces is scheduled and rationed, with people signing up for time slots, getting maybe an hour or two per week where they can be truly alone. What people do with this time varies wildly. Some meditate or pray, some just sit in silence, some cry without having to explain themselves to anyone. Some use the time to process difficult emotions they can't express in public. The settlement recognizes that this private time is psychologically essential, that without it, people would crack under the constant social pressure and lack of personal space. But there's never enough of these spaces, never enough quiet time for everyone who needs it. And the waiting lists are long, which means people often have to deal with their psychological needs without the benefit of solitude, working through their issues in the cramped, noisy reality of communal life. The concept of ambition in Speranza has transformed into something almost unrecognizable from what it meant in the old world. There are no career ladders to climb, no fortunes to build, no fame to achieve, no external markers of success that meant anything in the old world. Ambition in Speranza means wanting to contribute more, wanting to master a skill that helps the settlement, wanting to see your children survive and thrive, wanting to make life slightly better for the community. It's a scaled-down, internalized form of ambition that's focused on incremental improvements rather than dramatic achievements. Some people, especially from the older generation, struggle with this, feeling like their lives lack purpose, without the possibility of achieving something significant, without the chance to leave a legacy beyond just surviving another day. The younger generation seems to handle it better, having never known a world where grand ambitions were possible, accepting the constraints of their existence more readily? But even they sometimes feel the pull of wanting more, wanting something beyond the narrow confines of Speranza, and that wanting has nowhere to go becomes a kind of spiritual ache that no amount of community support can fully address. The council meetings in Speranza are exercises in impossible decision-making, where every choice has costs and benefits that affect people's lives in immediate and tangible ways. They decide who gets to have children, who gets access to limited medical treatments, how to allocate food when there's a shortfall, whether to spend resources on maintenance or on improving quality of life, how to handle disputes between residents. These decisions are made by committee, with arguments and votes, trying to be as fair and transparent as possible. But fairness is a relative concept when resources are scarce and survival is uncertain. The council members carry the weight of these decisions, knowing that their choices might mean someone doesn't get medicine they need, someone doesn't get to start a family, someone's living conditions get worse. It's a burden that wears on them, contributes to burnout and resignation, makes serving on the council something people do out of duty rather than desire. The settlement has term limits and rotation to prevent any individual from carrying this weight too long, but it also means constantly training new council members, constantly dealing with learning curves, constantly managing transitions. The alternative, having a permanent leadership, would concentrate power in ways that could become tyrannical, so they accept the inefficiencies of rotation as the price of maintaining some democratic accountability. The black market in Speranza is small but persistent, with people trading contraband items and services outside the official rationing system. There's a market for extra food, for luxury items that are supposed to be communally distributed, for favours and access, for things that the official system doesn't provide. The council knows about the black market and mostly tolerates it, recognising that trying to completely suppress it would require surveillance and enforcement that would make the settlement feel more like a prison than a community. There are limits, of course. Trading critical resources like medicine or weapons is severely punished, and anyone caught selling essentials meant for communal distribution faces serious consequences. But trading your own rations for someone else's, making deals to swap work shifts, exchanging personal items, these kinds of transactions happen constantly and are generally ignored as long as they don't threaten the settlement's stability. The black market serves as a pressure valve, allowing people to exercise some economic autonomy, to make choices about their lives in ways the official system doesn't permit. It also creates inequalities, with some people able to accumulate more than others through trading, but the scale is small enough that it hasn't become a major source of social tension, at least not yet. The physical fitness of Speranza's residents is generally poor compared to pre-invasion standards, with the cramped living conditions and limited space for exercise leading to a population that's mostly sedentary. The settlement has tried to address this, creating exercise programs, designating tunnels for walking, encouraging physical activity, but the reality is that space and time are too limited for regular exercise to be practical for most people. The result is a population with high rates of obesity, cardiovascular problems, muscle atrophy, all the health issues associated with inactive lifestyles. The children are slightly better off, with mandatory physical education included in their schooling, but even they don't get the level of activity that growing bodies need. The settlement's medical staff sees this as a major health crisis developing in slow motion, but they're powerless to address it given the constraints of the environment. They've proposed various solutions, from mandatory exercise requirements to redesigning living spaces to encourage movement, but all of these require resources and space that don't exist, so the proposals sit unrealised while the population's physical health slowly deteriorates. The art created in Speranza reflects the environment in interesting ways, with painters working on salvaged materials, sculptors using scrap metal and stone, musicians composing pieces that echo the sounds of the tunnels. There's a distinctive Speranza aesthetic emerging, dark and claustrophobic, but also defiant, celebrating small beauties and moments of light in the underground darkness. The settlement displays this art in communal spaces, rotating exhibitions, giving artists the chance to share their work and giving residents something beautiful to look at in an environment that's otherwise purely functional. The artists themselves occupy an ambiguous position in the social hierarchy, valued for the psychological benefits they provide, but also sometimes viewed as non-essential, as luxuries the settlement can't really afford. This creates tension for the artists, who feel both appreciated and guilty, who want to contribute to the community's well-being, but also wonder if their time would be better spent on practical work. The settlement has generally come down on the side of supporting art as essential to mental health and cultural preservation, but that support is always conditional, always subject to being withdrawn if resources get too tight. The linguistic drift happening in Speranza is subtle but noticeable, with new words being coined for underground realities and old words changing meaning or falling out of use. They've developed a whole vocabulary around the settlement's systems and spaces, technical terms that wouldn't make sense to anyone from the surface world, slang that reflects their unique culture. The children are growing up speaking a dialect that's diverging from standard Italian, incorporating words from other languages that survivors brought with them, creating hybrid phrases that draw from multiple linguistic traditions. In a few more generations, if Speranza survives, they might speak something that's recognizably descended from Italian, but different enough to be considered its own language. The linguists in the settlement find this fascinating from an academic perspective, watching language evolution happen in real time, but they're also concerned about the loss of connection to the broader Italian and human cultural tradition, about the isolation this linguistic drift represents. They've tried to preserve standard Italian through education, making sure children learn the formal language even as they speak their own dialect in daily life. But they know they're fighting a losing battle against natural linguistic evolution. The concept of justice in Speranza has evolved into something more focused on restoration and reconciliation than punishment, partly because they can't afford to lose people to imprisonment or exile except in the most extreme cases. When someone commits an offence, the response is usually mediation, restitution, community service, finding ways to repair the harm and reintegrate the offender into the community. This works surprisingly well for most offences, with people genuinely trying to make amends because they understand that their place in the community is their survival, that being ostracised would be catastrophic. But it also means that victims sometimes feel like justice wasn't served, like the consequences for serious offences are too lenient, like the community prioritises keeping the offender functional over acknowledging the harm they caused. The settlement has struggled with this balance, trying to honour both the need for accountability and the practical reality that they can't afford to throw people away. For the most serious offences, murder or sexual violence or actions that endanger the entire settlement, exile is still an option, essentially a death sentence since survival on the surface is impossible. These decisions are rare but traumatic for the entire community, requiring a near unanimous council vote and extensive deliberation, and they leave scars on everyone involved. The seasonal affective disorder that many residents experience isn't tied to seasons since there are no seasons underground, but rather to the monotony and sameness of every day, a kind of chronic low-grade depression that comes from environmental understimulation. The settlement's mental health professionals have tried various interventions, light therapy, environmental enrichment, social activities, but nothing really replicates the variety and stimulation of surface life. Some people adapt, find ways to create meaning and interest within the constraints, but others just endure, getting through each day without joy or enthusiasm, functionally depressed but not quite bad enough to be unable to work. This mass-mile depression is one of the settlement's hidden crises, affecting productivity and quality of life, but hard to address because it's not acute enough to demand immediate attention, and because the root cause, the environment itself, can't be changed. The medical staff has learned to recognize the signs, the flatness of affect, the lack of initiative, the going through motions, and they intervene when they can, but mostly they just document it, adding it to the long list of ways that underground life is slowly grinding down the human spirit. The relationships between Speranza and the concept of home have become complicated and painful. For the older generation, home is the surface world they lost, the places they came from, the lives they had before. Speranza is shelter, is refuge, is prison, but it's not home. It will never be home, no matter how long they live there. For the younger generation, especially those born in the settlement, Speranza is the only home they've ever known, and they can't quite understand their parents' grief for a world they never experienced. This creates a fundamental disconnect in how different generations relate to the settlement, with the old seeing it as temporary, despite years passing, and the young seeing it as permanent, as simply the way life is. The settlement has tried to bridge this gap through education and storytelling, making sure the younger generation understands what was lost. But understanding intellectually isn't the same as feeling emotionally, and the younger residents mostly just find their parents' nostalgia puzzling and slightly annoying. This generational divide over the concept of home affects everything from decision-making to cultural priorities to visions for the future, and it's only going to get more pronounced as time passes and the generation with surface memories eventually dies out. The technical knowledge being lost in Speranza isn't just about complex systems, but also about basic understanding of how the world works. Children are growing up without experiencing weather, without understanding seasons, without seeing the stars, without comprehending the scale of oceans or the height of mountains, and this creates fundamental gaps in their worldview that are hard to articulate but profoundly limiting. They learn about these things in school, they see pictures and videos, they hear descriptions, but it's all abstract, all theoretical, lacking the visceral understanding that comes from direct experience. The teachers struggle with this, trying to explain concepts like wind or rain or sunlight to kids who've never felt any of these things, who can't really grasp what they mean beyond intellectual definitions. This experiential poverty extends to all aspects of surface life, from ecology to geography, to simple things like what grass feels like under your feet or what the ocean smells like. The settlement is raising a generation that's fundamentally disconnected from the natural world, adapted to an entirely artificial environment, and nobody really knows what the long-term cognitive and psychological effects of this disconnection will be. Some researchers in the settlement have theorized that these children might develop different neural structures, different ways of thinking and perceiving, optimized for underground life, but potentially unable to function in a surface environment, even if that became possible. The maintenance of hope in Speranza requires active effort, deliberate cultivation, because the default emotional state when living in such circumstances tends toward despair. The settlement has developed rituals and practices specifically designed to generate and maintain hope. From the anniversary celebrations to the education system's emphasis on possibility, to the way they talk about the future, as if it's something that will happen rather than something that might. This manufactured hope feels artificial sometimes, feels like lying to themselves, but it serves a critical psychological function, giving people a reason to keep going, to keep working, to keep caring about tomorrow. Without hope, even if that hope is somewhat delusional, the settlement would likely collapse into nihilistic dysfunction, with people giving up on maintaining systems, giving up on relationships, giving up on life. So hope is cultivated and protected and reinforced even when there's not much rational basis for it, because the alternative is unthinkable. The older generation, more cynical and realistic, often plays along with this hopeful narrative for the sake of the younger generation, maintaining the fiction that everything will somehow work out even as they privately acknowledge that it probably won't. The younger generation, paradoxically, seems to genuinely believe in the possibility of a better future, either because they're more adaptable psychologically or because they've been successfully indoctrinated into hope by the settlement's cultural practices. The water rationing in Speranza is one of the most strictly enforced policies, with every drop accounted for and allocated according to complex formulas that balance human needs against system requirements. Personal hygiene uses the least water possible, with showers limited to once or twice a week and heavily timed, with water recycling systems capturing and filtering grey water for agricultural use. Drinking water is rationed by body weight and activity level, with everyone having a daily allowance that's just barely adequate for health. The psychological impact of constant thirst, of never quite being able to drink as much as you want, contributes to the overall stress and discomfort of life in the settlement. Water has become a kind of currency, with people sometimes trading portions of their water ration for other goods or services, and with access to extra water being a significant privilege. The settlement has had to implement strict penalties for water theft or waste, because any disruption to the water system could be catastrophic. There have been incidents where people were caught hoarding water or taking more than their ration, and the community response has been harsh, recognizing that this kind of selfishness directly threatens everyone's survival. The water filtration and purification systems are among the most critical infrastructure in the settlement, maintained with obsessive care, with redundant backups and constant monitoring. The engineers responsible for water systems have the highest status in the settlement, their expertise literally keeping everyone alive, and they carry that responsibility with a gravity that affects their entire lives. The development of Speranza-specific health conditions that didn't exist in the surface world reflects the unique stresses of underground life. There's a form of skeletal deterioration from lack of sunlight and limited physical activity that's affecting almost everyone. There's a respiratory condition from breathing filtered air that's not quite the same composition as surface atmosphere. There's a cluster of neurological symptoms that might be related to electromagnetic exposure from the settlement's electrical systems, or might be psychological in origin. There's a skin condition from lack of natural UV exposure and the constant humidity of the tunnels. The doctors are essentially practicing frontier medicine, diagnosing and treating conditions they've never seen before, making educated guesses about causes and treatments, documenting everything in the hope that this knowledge might be useful to future generations, if there are any. The settlement has become an unintentional medical research facility, generating data about human adaptation to extreme environments. But there's no one to share this data with, no broader medical community to contribute to, so it just accumulates in the archives, along with everything else they're preserving for a future that might never come. The political disagreements in Speranza tend to cluster around a few recurring issues that never quite get resolved, just endlessly debated and compromised on. There's the fundamental question of whether to prioritize short-term survival or long-term sustainability, whether to use resources now to improve quality of life or conserve them for future needs. There's the question of how much individual freedom to allow versus how much collective control is necessary for survival. There's the question of whether to maintain hope of eventually returning to the surface or accept that underground life is permanent. There's the question of how to balance genetic diversity concerns against reproductive freedom. These disagreements create factions that shift and reform around different issues, with alliances being tactical rather than ideological, people grouping together based on immediate concerns, rather than consistent political philosophies. The council has to navigate these factions carefully, building coalitions to get decisions made, compromising and negotiating constantly. The absence of formal political parties or structures means politics is very personal, based on relationships and trust and specific issues rather than abstract principles, which makes it simultaneously more flexible and more prone to personality conflicts. The entire political culture of Speranza is shaped by the reality that everyone knows everyone else, that there's no anonymity, that political disagreements happen between people who see each other every day and will continue to see each other every day, regardless of how heated the disagreement gets. This enforces a certain civility, a recognition that you can't afford to make permanent enemies in such a small community. But it also means that resentments simmer beneath polite surfaces, never fully expressed or resolved. The question of sexuality and reproduction in Speranza is fraught with complications that go beyond the official reproductive policies. In such a cramped environment with limited privacy, sexual activity is difficult to keep private, which creates social pressures and taboos that didn't exist in the same way in the surface world. The settlement has had to develop new norms around sexuality, acknowledging that people have needs, while also recognizing that unlimited reproduction would be catastrophic. There are contraceptive implants that everyone receives at puberty, which can only be removed with council approval for those authorized to have children, a system that feels oppressive to many, but that's seen as necessary for population control. Same-sex relationships are actually more accepted in Speranza than they were in some parts of pre-invasion society, partly because they don't raise population concerns, and partly because the settlement can't afford to discriminate against anyone for non-survival related reasons. The younger generation has developed a more fluid approach to sexuality and relationships than their parents, possibly as an adaptation to the constrained circumstances, possibly as a cultural evolution. There are polyamorous arrangements that would have been unusual in the old world, but that work in Speranza's context, where living space is shared and traditional family structures don't quite fit. The settlement generally takes a pragmatic approach to all of this, caring more about whether people are functioning and contributing than about the specific details of their private lives. But there are still tensions, still conflicts between traditional values and practical adaptation. The entertainment options in Speranza are severely limited, which contributes to the psychological challenges of underground life. There's a small library of movies and shows that were saved on hard drives, rationed out, and shown communally on precious screens powered by carefully allocated electricity. There are books, both physical and digital, passed around and read until they're falling apart or the files become corrupted. There are live performances, music and theatre and storytelling created by talented residents who provide these services as part of their contribution to the community. There are games, both traditional board games salvaged from the surface and new games invented in the settlement, ways to pass time and create social interaction. But all of this together doesn't come close to filling the hours of leisure time that the settlement's work schedule allows, which means people spend a lot of time just sitting, thinking, talking, existing in a state of mild boredom that's become the background noise of life. The children seem less affected by this, able to create elaborate games and imaginative play with minimal resources. But adults struggle more, especially those who remember the endless entertainment options available in the old world. The settlement has tried to address this by creating activities and events, classes where people can learn new skills, discussion groups, hobby clubs, anything to give people something to do with their time besides dwell on their situation. But there's only so much that can be organised in such a small community with such limited resources, so boredom remains a persistent problem that contributes to depression and social tension. The hierarchy of needs in Speranza is brutally clear in a way it never was in the complex surface world. Physical survival comes first, always, without exception. Food, water, air, shelter, these are the foundation that everything else depends on. Then comes health and safety, maintaining the systems that keep people alive, preventing accidents and injuries. Then comes community cohesion, maintaining the social bonds that make cooperation possible. Then, and only then, if resources allow, comes quality of life, comfort, entertainment, personal fulfillment. This hierarchy is enforced by the reality of their situation, not by policy, though policy reflects it. When systems fail or resources run short, the settlement contracts its concerns to the most basic level, abandoning everything non-essential until the crisis passes. This creates a kind of oscillation in the settlement's priorities, expanding to include culture and quality of life during good periods, contracting to pure survival during bad ones. The residents have learned to recognize these cycles, to appreciate the good times while they last and endure the bad times, knowing they'll eventually pass. It's a fundamentally different relationship to Maslow's hierarchy than existed in the Old World, where most people in developed countries could take the lower levels for granted and focus on higher needs. In Speranza, nobody ever gets to take survival for granted. It's always present, always demanding attention, always potentially one crisis away from collapse. The psychological adaptation required to live in Speranza has created what some of the settlement's therapists call survival mode consciousness, a mental state where people are constantly alert to threats, constantly monitoring their environment, never fully relaxed or at ease. This state of hypervigilance was adaptive in the early days when the settlement was still being established and dangers were everywhere, but it's become maladaptive now that the settlement is relatively stable, contributing to anxiety disorders, sleep problems, and chronic stress. The body and mind aren't designed to maintain high alert indefinitely. They need periods of rest and recovery, but in Speranza, those periods are hard to come by because the threats, while less immediate, are still real and present. The settlement has tried to create safe spaces and practices that allow people to lower their guard temporarily. Meditation rooms, relaxation exercises, designated quiet times, where non-essential systems are shut down to create a sense of peace, but these measures only partially address the problem. The fundamental issue is that living in a precarious situation creates precarious psychology, and no amount of intervention can fully compensate for an environment that genuinely is dangerous and uncertain. The younger generation shows some signs of better adaptation, their nervous systems calibrated to underground life from birth, but they also show signs of never having experienced true safety and relaxation, having no baseline of security to compare their current state to, which might be its own form of psychological damage. The relationships between Speranza's residents and the concept of the future have become increasingly abstract and uncertain. In the old world, people planned for futures that extended years or decades, saving for retirement, planning careers, imagining their children's lives. In Speranza, the future is much more immediate and contingent, measured in months or maybe a few years at most, always contingent on systems continuing to function and resources continuing to last. Long-term planning exists, but it's more theoretical than practical, more hopeful than confident. Parents still want better lives for their children, but what that means in the context of Speranza is unclear, since the children's options are so limited and their futures so uncertain. The settlement makes plans for infrastructure maintenance and resource management, projecting needs and capabilities years ahead. But everyone knows these plans are as much wishful thinking as serious projection, based on assumptions that might not hold. This foreshortened time horizon affects how people live, making them more present-focused, less willing to sacrifice now for hypothetical future benefits, more interested in immediate quality of life than long-term outcomes. It's created a culture that's simultaneously more focused on community and legacy, wanting to leave something for the next generation, and more fatalistic about whether there will be a next generation to inherit anything. The council struggles with this tension constantly, trying to make decisions that balance present needs against future sustainability while knowing that future might never arrive. The sensory deprivation inherent in underground life has led to some residents developing what might be called sensory hunger, a desperate craving for experiences that the settlement can't provide. They hunger for the feeling of wind, for the smell of rain, for the taste of fresh fruit, for the sight of stars, for the sound of birdsong, for all the sensory richness that surface life provided and that underground life lacks. Some people develop fixations on particular sensations they remember, talking about them obsessively, describing them in detail to anyone who will listen, almost fetishizing the memory. Others try to recreate surface experiences using whatever materials are available, making approximations that are simultaneously comforting and painful in their inadequacy. There are cooking groups that try to recreate dishes from the surface using the limited ingredients available, never quite succeeding but finding meaning in the attempt. There are artists who paint landscapes they remember or imagine, trying to capture colours and light that don't exist underground. There are people who hoard scents, tiny vials of perfume or spices, rationing them out in microscopic amounts to occasionally smell something other than the damp stone and recycled air of the tunnels. The settlement recognises this sensory hunger as a legitimate psychological need and tries to address it through sensory enrichment programs. But the resources for this are minimal and the impact limited. The best they can do is acknowledge the loss, validate the hunger, and help people find ways to cope with what can't be satisfied. The concept of wilderness and nature has become almost mystical in Speranza, taking on meanings and significance that go beyond the actual physical reality of ecosystems and environment. For people who will never see wilderness again, it becomes a symbol of freedom, beauty, complexity, all the things their underground life lacks. The children learn about nature in school, studying ecology and biology and environmental science, learning the names of plants and animals they'll never encounter, understanding systems they'll never experience directly. This creates a strange relationship to nature, where it's simultaneously deeply valued as part of human heritage and completely abstract as lived reality. The settlement has tried to maintain some connection to the natural world through the hydroponic gardens, growing plants that serve both practical and symbolic purposes, creating small green spaces that residents can visit and tend. These gardens are cherished far beyond their utilitarian value, representing a living connection to the surface world, proof that growth and life continue even underground. People spend time in the gardens not just for work, but for psychological restoration, finding something calming and hopeful about being around growing things. The settlement has debates about whether to grow purely practical crops or to dedicate some resources to ornamental plants, flowers that serve no purpose except beauty, and generally they compromise, growing mostly food but allowing some space for a few flowers that bloom in the artificial light, tiny splashes of colour in the grey and brown world of the tunnels. The intergenerational trauma developing in Speranza is subtle but pervasive, with the first generation's grief and terror and loss being transmitted to their children and grandchildren in ways that shape personality and worldview, even for those who never experienced the Ark invasion directly. The children absorb their parents' anxiety, their hypervigilance, their sense of precariousness, growing up with the emotional legacy of trauma they didn't experience firsthand. The settlement's therapists see this pattern and worry about it, recognizing that trauma can compound across generations if not addressed. But the resources for therapeutic intervention are limited and the environment itself continues to be traumatic, so there's only so much that can be done. The settlement has tried to create cultural practices that help process and integrate trauma, rather than just passing it down unexamined, storytelling and ritual and communal grieving that allow people to acknowledge loss without being consumed by it. But the success of these practices is mixed. Some families seem to handle the intergenerational transmission better than others, creating narratives of resilience and survival rather than just victimhood and loss, but the settlement as a whole carries a collective trauma that shapes its culture in profound ways. The concept of normalcy in Speranza has shifted so dramatically that what would have seemed like dystopian nightmare conditions in the old world are now just accepted as normal life. Children grow up thinking that living in cramped tunnels with rationed food and water is just how life is, that never seeing the sky is normal, that constant scarcity is normal. For them, the surface world their parents describe sounds fantastical, almost too good to be true, like fairy tales about magical lands that never really existed. This normalization of extreme conditions is adaptive in some ways, allowing people to function without constant distress, but it also represents a kind of psychological lowering of expectations, a resetting of what humans consider acceptable living conditions. The settlement's leadership worries about this, concerned that if expectations drop too low, people will stop pushing for improvement, will accept degradation and decline as inevitable rather than fighting to maintain standards. But they also recognize that some degree of normalization is necessary for psychological survival, that you can't maintain a state of constant outrage and grief about your circumstances and still function day to day. The balance between accepting reality and refusing to normalize the unacceptable is delicate, different for each person, never quite resolved. The skill degradation happening in Speranza is another form of knowledge loss that's harder to track than technological regression, but equally concerning. People who had specialized skills from the surface world, skills that aren't needed in the settlement, are losing those abilities through disuse. There are former doctors who specialized in fields that aren't relevant underground, engineers who worked with systems that don't exist in Speranza, artists who worked in media that aren't available. These people try to maintain their skills through practice and teaching, but without real application, abilities fade, muscle memory degrades, knowledge becomes theoretical rather than practical. The settlement has tried to preserve these skills through documentation and education, making sure the knowledge gets passed down, even if it can't be actively used. But there's a question of value here, of whether it's worth dedicating resources to maintaining abilities that might never be needed again. The pragmatists argue for focusing only on immediately useful skills, while the preservationists insist that maintaining the full breadth of human capability is essential for cultural continuity and for the possibility of eventual surface return. The compromise they've reached is to document everything but prioritize teaching and practicing the most immediately relevant skills, which means some specialized knowledge is slowly becoming historical curiosity rather than living practice. The religious and spiritual evolution in Speranza has produced some unexpected theological developments as people try to reconcile their traditional faiths with the reality of the Ark invasion and underground exile. Some have developed theodicies that explain the invasion as divine punishment or test, incorporating the Ark machines into existing religious frameworks. Others have moved toward more deistic or agnostic positions, maintaining belief in some higher power, but questioning its involvement in human affairs. There's a growing movement, especially among younger residents, toward a kind of earth-based spirituality that sees the underground refuge as a return to the womb of the planet, a necessary retreat into darkness before eventual rebirth. The settlement's various religious leaders have mostly managed to coexist peacefully, recognizing that division over doctrine would be catastrophic in such a small community, but there are tensions, different visions of what their suffering means, and what their future might hold. Prayer and worship services happen regularly in designated spaces, providing comfort and community for believers, but attendance has been declining among younger generations who find traditional religion increasingly irrelevant to their actual lived experience. The settlement hasn't become atheistic exactly, but it's becoming more secular, with spiritual concerns taking a back seat to immediate practical realities. The archive of pre-invasion human culture, stored in Speranza's digital libraries, represents an incredibly valuable, but also incredibly fragile repository of knowledge. The data is stored on multiple redundant systems with different storage media to protect against failure. But all of these systems are degrading, suffering from bit rot and media deterioration and the simple passage of time. The archivists spend significant time and resources on data migration, copying files from failing storage to newer media, checking integrity, maintaining backups, but they're fighting a losing battle against entropy. Some data has already been lost, files that became corrupted before anyone noticed, media that failed before it could be migrated, knowledge that slipped away into digital oblivion. Each loss is mourned by the archivists who see themselves as guardians of human civilization, who feel personally responsible for preserving everything they can. But the reality is that they can't save everything. They have to prioritize, decide what's most important to preserve. And those decisions are agonizing, because how do you compare the value of scientific papers versus classic literature, versus historical records, versus art and music? The settlement has developed criteria for prioritization, focusing on immediately useful technical knowledge and broad cultural touchstones. But this means that more specialized or niche content is at higher risk of loss. The communication systems within Speranza are a mix of old technology repurposed for new uses and improvised solutions that barely work but somehow keep functioning. There's a wired intercom system connecting different sections of the settlement using salvaged cable and equipment, allowing for basic voice communication between areas. There's a message board system, both physical boards where people post written notices and a digital equivalent on the few shared terminals, serving as the settlement's primary means of mass communication. There's a bell system for emergencies, different patterns of rings indicating different types of crises, a low-tech backup that doesn't rely on electricity or complex systems. The settlement has no external communication capability, no way to send or receive messages from outside, which is partly a security measure to avoid detection by ARC machines, and partly just a reflection of the fact that there's nobody out there to communicate with as far as they know. This isolation is profound and troubling, the sense of being cut off not just physically, but informationally from the rest of the world, having no idea what's happening beyond their tunnels, whether there are other survivors, whether the ARC machines are still active everywhere, or have moved on, whether Earth is even still habitable on the surface. The settlement has debated whether to try establishing some form of long-range communication, maybe using old radio equipment, maybe trying to set up a relay system, but every analysis concludes that the risk of detection far outweighs any potential benefit, so they remain silent, invisible, alone in the darkness. The dietary deficiencies in Speranza are managed as well as possible with supplements and careful meal planning, but there are still nutritional gaps that affect health in various ways. The lack of dietary variety means people develop cravings for specific nutrients their bodies need, sometimes manifesting as intense desires for foods they can't have, sometimes as pica-like behaviours where people chew on non-food items seeking minerals or textures. The settlement's nutritionists do their best to balance the limited available foods into complete nutrition, but it's an ongoing challenge with the restricted agricultural output and no access to the diverse food sources that sustained humanity for millennia. Protein is particularly challenging, with the insect farming providing adequate amounts, but in a form many people find psychologically difficult to accept, especially the older generation who remember when meat came from recognizable animals. The younger generation has adapted better to eating insects, never having known anything else, viewing it as normal food rather than desperate survival rations. The settlement has tried to process the insect protein into forms that are less obviously insects, grinding it into flour or forming it into patties, making it more palatable for those who struggle with the idea of entomophagy. There are occasional treats when someone successfully traps a rat in the tunnels, and these are celebrated disproportionately to their actual nutritional value, representing a connection to the mammalian meat that was once a staple of human diet. The social bonds in Speranza are simultaneously stronger and more fragile than in the surface world, intensified by proximity and shared circumstances, but also strained by the constant stress and lack of privacy. People form deep connections out of necessity and genuine affection, creating chosen families and support networks that sustain them through difficult times. But these same relationships can become claustrophobic and oppressive, with no ability to get away from people you're having conflicts with. No way to end a relationship cleanly when you'll continue seeing that person every day for the rest of your life. The settlement has developed mediation and conflict resolution systems specifically to handle the unique challenges of forced proximity, helping people work through disputes before they escalate into violence or permanent rifts. There's an understanding that maintaining functional relationships is a survival skill in Speranza, that you have to find ways to forgive and move forward, because holding grudges indefinitely would make life unbearable for everyone. This creates a culture that's simultaneously more forgiving and more repressed than the surface world, where people let things go that they might have fought over in other circumstances, but also where resentments build up over years with no release valve. The few trained counsellors in the settlement spend much of their time doing relationship mediation, helping people navigate the complexities of maintaining human connection in inhuman circumstances. The concept of ownership and property in Speranza has become much more communal than in the surface world, with most resources being collectively owned and distributed according to need. People have personal possessions, items they brought from the surface or made in the settlement, but the concept of private property is limited by space constraints and survival necessities. Living quarters are assigned rather than owned, and can be reassigned if the settlement's needs change. Tools and equipment are communal resources, checked out and returned, maintained collectively. Even clothing is somewhat communal, with people sharing and trading garments as needed, especially as items wear out and can't be replaced. This shift toward communal ownership reduces some conflicts, eliminating competition over resources that need to be shared anyway, but it also creates friction for people who came from cultures with strong private property traditions, who feel like they've lost autonomy and control over their lives. The settlement has tried to preserve some sphere of private ownership, allowing people to keep personal items that have sentimental rather than practical value, recognizing that some sense of ownership is psychologically important, even if economically it's inefficient. The younger generation, growing up in this more communal system, seems more comfortable with it, not having the same attachment to private ownership that their parents do, viewing resources as naturally collective rather than naturally individual. The exercise and physical activity limitations in Speranza have led to creative adaptations, with people developing workout routines that can be done in confined spaces, using resistance bands and bodyweight exercises and improvised equipment. There are yoga and stretching groups that meet in whatever space is available, helping people maintain flexibility and manage stress. There's a walking club that makes circuits through the tunnels, measuring their routes in meters and tracking their progress, trying to stay active within the constraints of their environment. The settlement has designated some tunnels as exercise corridors where people can walk or jog without interfering with other activities. Those space limitations mean these have to be shared and scheduled. Children get more dedicated physical activity time, with mandatory exercise periods built into their education, recognition that growing bodies need movement to develop properly. But even with all these efforts, the overall activity levels are far below what humans evolved for, and the health consequences are visible in the population's physical condition. The settlement's medical staff advocates constantly for more resources dedicated to exercise and physical activity, arguing that preventing health problems is more efficient than treating them, but space and time remain the limiting factors that no amount of advocacy can overcome. The mental maps that long-time Speranza residents carry in their heads are incredibly detailed and three-dimensional, adapted to navigating the complex tunnel system that makes up their world. They navigate by landmarks that would be meaningless to an outsider: a particular colour of stone, a slight change in airflow, the sound of water running through pipes, developing almost echolocation, like sensitivity to their environment. New residents or children struggle initially with the disorienting sameness of the tunnels, getting lost in passages that all look alike, but over time they develop the same internalized spatial awareness that veterans have. The settlement has tried to implement wayfinding systems, painting markers and posting signs, creating maps that people can reference, but ultimately navigation in Speranza is learned through experience and repetition, building mental models that can't quite be captured on paper. The complexity of the tunnel system is both a strength and a vulnerability, providing multiple routes and redundancy, but also creating confusion and potential for getting lost, especially in the less travelled areas where maintenance is minimal and conditions can be dangerous. There have been incidents of people wandering into unmapped sections and becoming lost, sometimes for days before being found, sometimes never found at all, their fates unknown, bodies presumably somewhere in the dark passages beyond the settled areas. These disappearances haunt the community, creating myths and ghost stories, cautionary tales about straying too far from known areas, reminders that even in their refuge, there are dangers. The lighting in Speranza is carefully managed to simulate day and night cycles, helping residents maintain circadian rhythms despite being underground. The main living areas follow a schedule of brighter light during designated day hours and dimmer light during night hours, though the darkness never reaches true night levels, because complete darkness in the tunnels would be psychologically devastating and practically dangerous. The settlement uses LED lights almost exclusively, chosen for their efficiency and longevity, creating a quality of light that's somewhat harsh and artificial, but adequate for seeing and working. There are areas with warmer, more natural-looking lights reserved for relaxation spaces and living quarters, rationed luxuries that make those areas feel more comfortable and livable. The constant artificial lighting has effects on people's vision, with many residents developing light sensitivity and eye strain adapted to the specific spectrum of the LEDs, but struggling with any variation. The settlement's optometrists, working with salvaged equipment and no ability to manufacture new lenses, do what they can to help people with vision problems, but options are limited and degrading over time. The younger generation growing up under artificial light shows some adaptations, their eyes developing differently than surface dwellers, though whether these adaptations are beneficial or harmful in the long term is unknown. The power generation in Speranza is one of the settlement's most critical and precarious systems, relying on a combination of sources that are all finite and degrading. There are generators burning biofuel produced from agricultural waste, inefficient but renewable as long as the farms keep producing. There are batteries charged during generator runs and used to smooth out power delivery, but these batteries are aging and losing capacity with each charge cycle. There are human-powered generators for critical backup systems, bicycle-like devices that people can pedal to generate electricity in emergencies, exhausting work that can't be sustained for long. The settlement's total power budget is tiny compared to surface standards, measured in kilowatts rather than megawatts, carefully allocated to essential systems with nothing left over for comfort or luxury. The power rationing creates a hierarchy of needs, with life support systems getting first priority, then food production, then lighting and communication, then everything else. During power shortages, non-essential systems shut down completely, plunging the settlement into a more primitive mode of operation that's sustainable but deeply uncomfortable.